Welcome to the Product Design Podcast. I'm your host, Seth Coelen, founder of UX Cabin, where we create world-class web and mobile apps. I'm excited to bring you a behind-the-scenes look into the lives of some of the most interesting and talented people in product design. We'll get strategic advice on how they got to where they are today and things they wish they would have known earlier in their career. Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining us on the Product Design Podcast. We have a really cool guest for us today. We got Michael Riddering. He is the founding designer of Maven and the creator of Figma Academy. Michael, I know you go by Rid, so I'll call you Rid here in the rest of the talk. So yeah, Rid, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and where you live?
Absolutely. So thank you first and foremost for having me on, Seth. It means a lot. Pretty excited to get going here. And yeah, you covered a lot of it, but the main things are I recently moved to Michigan with my beautiful wife and two Great Dane dogs that makes up our little family. And I started working for Maven last year remotely. And then I also work on my own course, Figma Academy, like you said. And so much of my days is spent thinking about online course platforms and marketing and teaching design and everything that goes into that.
That's perfect. I think so many of our listeners are either trying to break into UX, they're early in UX, or they're an individual that wants to level up in UX and product design. So I know we're going to get a lot of useful insight from you. Looking at the field right now, there's so many different ways to get into the field, and it's not like an easy linear path, like go get this degree and you'll have a job on the back end of it. It's like you could go the self-taught route, you could do courses, you could do a boot camp, you could go to school and get an interactive media degree. So I know we'll get into this when we get into some of your philosophy on how you teach design and what you want to accomplish with Figma Academy. But when we start out with the basics of like, how did you yourself get into product design in the first place?
Yeah, I had a pretty backwards entry, which I think kind of inspires a lot of how I think about design education broadly. And the short answer is by accident. I was in college and realized about halfway through that even though I was an economics major, I didn't really want to get into finance, and I wanted to get into tech and startups and specifically like build businesses. And so the first thing I started to do was like hopped onto Code Academy and tried to teach myself to code, and it just went terribly. And I knew that wasn't the route for me, but I also didn't want to be just an idea guy. You know, I wanted to be able to contribute to the product and actually like get my hands dirty. And so the only thing really left at the time in my head was, well, what about designing this thing? And so I spent a summer, I think when I was like 19, I just like cracked a version of Adobe Illustrator, and I was working at this accelerator for tech startups. And I would just watch YouTube tutorials and then make Flinto prototypes. And then I would just walk around the office and show them to anyone who would give me like 30 seconds to look at my Flinto prototypes. And to say that I didn't have formal training was like such a radical understatement, because it was super hacky. And I was kind of just learning on the job, because I ended up working for my own startup almost 5 years. And I was the only non-technical person. And so on one hand, I'm doing like all the sales and customer success. We're building this like SaaS marketplace. And on the other, I'm doing all of the design, but you kind of don't know what you don't know, right? You're just like thrust into this environment of collaborating with developers and experiencing all the frustrations of just encountering black box after black box and not really being sure of like how this works. And I remember Googling like, what is a design system for the first time, and having conversations where I'm realizing like, oh my gosh, what is getting shipped to production doesn't look anything like what I have in Sketch. And kind of crossing a lot of those bridges on my own and just reading Medium articles. Like that was basically how I learned design.
That's fascinating. I think design is a lot more like cooking than it is particularly a like traditional go to school for this degree type of job, where you kind of have a more instructive linear path of like accounting or science or whatever. Because it's like in the same vein of like cooking, no one has to give you permission to cook, or you don't need like credentials. And it's just like the way you get better at it is you just fumble yourself through making a couple bad meals. Then you start to get your comfort level and you start to be able to make more things. You get some staples that you make for your family or things that you're really good at. And I think it's kind of similar in design where it's like you were just saying, you're just playing around with Flinto and trying to make prototypes. And there's no way to necessarily fast track your being awesome at that. It's like you got to make a bunch of recipes that kind of suck at first. And that's how you grow. That's how you get better. You got to put in the time, right?
Totally. It's cool because we live in this world that isn't gated by any real set of credentials. Like, yeah, sure, if you have your master's in HCI, like definitely does not hurt. But I've never been asked one time what, even if I went to college, not even like, what is my degree? Like, did you even go to college? People don't really care. Like, it's cool to live in this ecosystem that is very much so proof of work and not really show me your resume. And the con or the flip side of that then is like, yeah, there's also not one linear path at all. There's so many different ways that you can approach the industry and kind of chart your path to break in.
Totally. I think it's a double-edged sword, right? Because like there's not really gatekeepers that you need permission to break into it, or you need, a threshold of education or connections or whatever. But it's also weird because like, yeah, you don't have that direct path. And one thing I've always said to people who are starting out, and I think people can kind of get frustrated when they start out because it's like, I just need someone to take a chance on me, or I need someone to give me an opportunity. And while those are great, and I think eventually people do get those opportunities, I think you can kind of make your own opportunity, whether that's just posting things on Dribbble, on Twitter, in different communities. If you're kind of good at maybe just one little piece of UX or design, maybe it's, making hero images on landing pages, or maybe it's social media graphics, or, whatever it takes to break in. And, you can promote this maybe on Upwork or on Dribbble, or just make your own opportunity to get someone to say like, sure, I'll give you $15 an hour to do that. And then you build up those skills, you keep going. But yeah, it's kind of tough because it's like, you kind of have to make your own opportunity to break into it.
Totally. I mean, kind of just continuing the story of how I broke in, like a lot of startups at the end of the day, mine did not work out after many years and, a bunch of money raised and all that. And I kind of was left with, okay, now what? Like what? I definitely don't have the energy to start over on something new. So, and I'm like in a ton of debt. I just got married. Like, what do I do? And I realized that over the last few years, the thing that I enjoyed the most was the design part. And so then it was like, okay, well, how do you get to the point where you can make money doing this and people would take you seriously, especially when I don't have this like ladder of design roles that I've been accumulating over the years. And man, I just spent a bunch of time on the For Hire subreddit, and I was just throwing my hat into the ring. Anything design related, I just applied for all of it. Built so many websites that I like, I mean, just, you just go through the mud basically, but it paid the bills. I was building up a portfolio. I was building up also a list of things that I knew I didn't want to work on. And ultimately, those were like very necessary stepping stones for me to take.
Yeah, that's incredible. So why don't you tell us a little bit more of your career history and some of the highs and lows of that time?
Yeah, that's a good question. The first year after doing the startup was, I mean, there were so many peaks and valleys just in that 1 year, because initially you come out of this like not having formal training, not having went to design school, and you have no idea whether you can actually make a career out of this. And right away, I was getting some traction and people were kind of looking at some of my work. I made like a Dribbble page and stuff like that. And I was getting some kind of positive feedback. And so then you're just on a high and you're like, oh man, like maybe I can actually do this. And then quickly that just goes down, because you're like, oh baby, it is so hard to find jobs. And like, do I want, like, what kind of a company do I apply for? I don't even know the right words to put on my resume and like skills and LinkedIn and stuff like that. So that was all pretty difficult. I did a bunch of freelancing and realized I wanted to figure out a little bit more of a stable path. And I ended up taking my first ever salaried role at the age of, gosh, I don't really remember, 26, 27, something like that. And I was working for a 30-person agency, mostly developers, and there was like 4 or 5 designers. And I started working on this open source project. It was actually really cool. We were doing basically like a React native system for like larger technologically savvy churches to create their custom mobile apps. And so like that was a really fun challenge because it was the first time that I was thrust into a really robust front end system. And I'm working really closely with engineers that are invested in me because they want me to know what I'm doing so that their lives can get a little bit easier. And so like I was surrounded with a couple people, one of which I'm really good friends with, and I actually brought to Maven. And so I just got off the call with him about an hour ago, and he like poured into me in terms of just like, this is how you can really make a design system work. And it opened my eyes to the more technical side of the craft. And that really was a tipping point for me. And I just got so excited about how design really plays with code and what it actually looks like to work with engineers. And like, while this is happening, I had started building out like my personal website in Webflow, and I had a different developer kind of sit down with me and be like, this is how CSS works. This is how it works in Webflow. And just even like an hour, like opened my mind like crazy. And so as I'm tinkering with Webflow and working within this design system, it started to click, right? Like I'm actually understanding how a front end layout works. And that was a pretty monumental year for me because I think it's defined a lot of my own personal journey where like, I'm definitely more of a technical designer. I can't draw anything to save my life, like I suck at marketing graphics, and that's okay. Like it's great for me. So yeah.
That's interesting. So just in terms of like understanding timeline, how long do you think it kind of took you from the point where you're like, yeah, I think I want to give UX design a chance and a go at it, to like struggling through freelance stuff to get your first salary job?
Yeah, good question. I should have brushed up on this, but I believe that would have probably been close to 1.5 years, if I'm remembering correctly. So I did quite a bit of freelancing up until that. And it started with mainly just websites, which was also kind of one of the forcing functions for me to learn Webflow as well. Because like one of the clients specifically wanted a Webflow site.
Yeah.
And it was fun. I also realized like web design, it's super cool because there's like, it almost like breaks free of a lot of the constraints that we deal with in product design. But I liked the richness and depth of product design. And so around that time, I started helping out a different startup on their product and really realized like, this is where I want to be. And it's harder, or at least in my experience, like I found it more difficult in that initial year to find contract roles that were more about product design than like, hey, can you build this website for me? And that was one of the things that made me realize like, I think that I want to work on a team that is like dedicating themselves to this one product, because that's like the area that I find the most interesting.
That's really interesting. Were you kind of like freelancing because that was like the only way that you felt like you could get work, as opposed to like that's how you kind of had to level up and you couldn't necessarily just throw your resume at a full-time job and get it? So this was like building that resume and paying the bills at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, that's basically the answer. I think there's probably this element too of like, I didn't have a lot of confidence in my own ability to sell myself as a designer, like I wouldn't have called myself a designer, even though I was designing products for years. Like I still wouldn't have referred to myself as a designer. I was a founder, like, and a salesperson.
Yeah.
And so I didn't have this rich portfolio. I only had this one, granted, it was huge, but like it was one thing that I made.
Right.
And I didn't think that I was going to be able to get a good job, I guess.
Yeah. So when did you kind of get over the fear of calling yourself a designer? Or I guess that's probably imposter syndrome that you were feeling.
Totally.
But when did you become comfortable with that?
I honestly, I think that I probably would draw that line at getting that first role like a year and a half later.
Yeah.
And like, I think that's silly, kind of. Like, I should have called myself a designer. I should have called myself a designer even when I was still working on my own startup. But it just felt big and scary and undeserved. And so I was more just like, I was just this guy that was designing things, not a designer, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I kind of remember that like point when I was starting out, and I was just basically fell into creating websites in college. And I remember I was starting to get paid for it. And back then, when I was in college, we called ourselves web designers. UX wasn't really the term then. So I was like, I was just driving in my car. And I'm a web designer. And I was just like, that felt like so crazy to me, like kind of audacious to like call myself that at the time. I'm like, I feel like there needs to be some more like ceremonious type of thing I have to go through. Like,
where's my plaque on the wall?
Right. Exactly. And I was like, that feels, so like crazy to say. I'm like, okay, listen, I'm getting paid for this. I'm, doing good work, as good as I can at the time, good enough to get paid for it. I want to do it more. So why don't I just lean into this and, perception is reality. I think even to ourselves sometimes, but I'm like, if I kind of like shy away from this, like, how am I going to get more work? I got to like go all in on this. I got to be like, yes, I am this, and give the people I'm working with confidence that like, this is my like persona, like web design as a personality. I need to like take on this and become this thing.
Yeah. I love that.
Cool. So, thinking back to like where you are now and kind of some of the different careers and spots that you've been in, is there anything that you look back over your time and you say like, oh, I wish I would have watched out for this red flag, or I wish I would have really appreciated this awesome position or opportunity I was in looking back?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that I could have benefited a lot from being less closed off to at least just understanding how basic code works early on in my career. Like I didn't have the best experience. And so I just threw a wall up and I was like, no, I'm a designer. Like, I don't need to think about that, And I think that what intimidated me was like syntax and what felt like, memorization of all these lines of code. And like, what if I forget this semicolon? That drove me crazy. And what I've realized since then is it's so much less about individual syntax. Like, I don't care if I can't write code. The important thing is like, do I understand the basic logic behind it and the basic building blocks of it? And that's not hard. That does not have to be this like go through a 12-month boot camp. That could be as simple as like start building things in Webflow and you'll just learn how it works, because if you can build it in Webflow, then you know that it's possible in code. And it took me way too long to figure that out. And I had people around me that probably would have really invested in that part of my skill set.
Yeah. So I think the really interesting thing with code is like, there's just like a few foundational front end things that can help you as a designer so much.
Yeah.
Just by knowing like a CSS grid, like how does auto layout in Figma compare to how actual websites like reflow and resize content, and just basic browser defaults, like, well, what's a drop down, a native drop down compared to like a custom drop down that you have to make, and just like knowing what you have available at your easiest code level, and then knowing like if it's worth designing something different or that would change the browser default from, like the fastest thing to do. And it's just like a greater context that you can know, that you can design with like better intention behind whatever it is, whatever the priority of the thing is.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's like so much of what we do as designers is think about different trade-offs and trying to find that sweet spot between the perfect solution and the one that like totally moves the needle with a significantly less amount of effort. And without an understanding of like, obviously you don't need to be able to scope development things. Like there's a level of behind the scenes that I don't think that we should be expected to be able to like know off the top of our heads or be able to like communicate easily. But the important thing is like, can we get to the point where we have the conversational building blocks that are necessary to uncover what those like edges of the spectrum are and have like real conversations with developers to find that right solution based off of some level of understanding of like complexity on their end and be able to just talk the talk. Like that has opened so many doors for me. And like when I even think about how I want to impact design education as a whole, like so much of it comes down to this idea of like, how can we make it way easier for designers to effectively think like developers and like strengthen that relationship as a result.
Yeah, that sounds like a really good segue into Figma Academy and some of your, background and reasonings for why you started that. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what Figma Academy is?
Yeah, so Figma Academy is a more advanced product design course that's focused on craft and some of these technical elements that we were talking about before. And also just like how to make you as a designer more valuable within the team and thinking about how do you collaborate with engineers? How do you build layouts that make sense and build components that make sense? So that is how it like works from a curriculum standpoint. What makes it a little bit unique is the entire thing is built inside of Figma. So I essentially created like a teachable-esque LMS within Figma, just using all of the building blocks that they have available and then just like a big set of components essentially.
Wow, that's incredible. So what led you to want to build Figma Academy in the first place?
Yeah. So it actually goes back a couple years ago, actually probably even more than that now. I had someone reach out to me. They were creating this like front end collective. It was right before COVID hit, and they asked if I wanted to teach something on Figma. And I thought it was pretty interesting. And it kind of started me thinking about like, what might that entail? And that led me to this idea of like, man, you should just be able to learn Figma in Figma. Why do I have to like go through this separate video series on a different platform? Like it should just be in Figma. It can all exist there. And so that got like my wheels spinning. Ultimately, that whole front end collective nothing came out of that anyway, but it like planted the seed. And then the other thing that was happening in my life was I randomly connected with this person that wanted to make a career switch from more just like blue collar working with his hands to product design. And I liked him and I wanted to help. And so I met with him weekly for about a year, and it was so life-giving for me. Like I loved just mentoring and teaching and watching him level up way faster than I was able to. And at the end of that process, I had come to this place where I was like, man, I want to do that again. But how can I do that at scale? Like, how can I maximize impact? And so you kind of had these like two ideas that were marinating in me. And so then at that point, I realized I want to launch some kind of a course. I don't know what it would be yet. The design learning journey is so wide. I don't know which sliver I want to carve out, but I know I want to do something. And that was where I was at. Early fall 2020 would have been the timeline.
Wow. What was kind of your philosophy in setting up the curriculum? Because like you and I both know there's no shortage of design courses someone could take.
Yeah.
So what was your angle on this? And what did you think that you were filling in the market that wasn't there?
Yeah, great question. It's interesting. Like that, where I wanted to insert myself changed a lot over the course of a year and a half, because the high level concept that was most interesting to me was this idea of like practical UI, like less theory and more just like practical. And as a result of being interested in that general area, I had my eye on this other course called Shift Nudge. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but anyway, I thought what MDS was doing was incredible. And then he put out a tweet one day and was like, hey, I have too much on my plate. I'm looking to hire a design advisor to help me with the course. And I was like, whoa, that's so interesting. I had just committed to spending a little bit every single day on whatever Figma Academy would become. And so I couldn't just tell. I was like, is this a big distraction? Or is it like this awesome opportunity? And so I ended up going for it. And I learned a ton about just like online courses in general. Most importantly, made a great friend in Matt. But the main thing that I learned was I do not want to do practical UI because there is no freaking way that I'm competing head to head with what he's built at Shift Nudge. And so then I was like, what do I do? Like, how can I build something that is complementary to the best early stage courses? And where that brought me was this realization that actually there's a shockingly limited supply of courses that are geared towards more like mid and even senior career people. And at the same time, I had been building up an email list behind the scenes because I had this Figma Academy landing page, even though I had done basically nothing tangible behind the scenes. And so I had this email list and I sent out a type form that was effectively, it was just testing different value propositions. And by far, the keyword that was resonating the most was the word advanced. And so I was like, that is fascinating. I think there might be an opportunity to position Figma Academy as basically the most advanced course out there and use that as my wedge that I can then expand from to account for more and more of the overarching design learning journey.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Now, I'm guessing it's a very opinionated course in the fact that it is specifically dealing with your UI skill set within Figma. So maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the differences between like an opinionated design course versus an unopinionated one.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually, because I hadn't really considered how opinionated the course is, but it totally is. And I think that also it goes hand in hand with like the further you go into the deep end, the more difficult it is to create something that is just like generic enough to be timeless, even, like part of my job is staying at the very forefront of like what is possible in Figma. And I guess there's two different ways that Figma Academy can be somewhat opinionated. One is I like to take things and convert them into repeatable systems. And so like color theory, for instance, color theory is it's inherently artsy and creative and open-ended, and it can just go any way. But like for me, as someone that is not, I wouldn't consider myself an artist, that was always really intimidating for me. It was this black box. Like, how do you set up, how do I even think about color and how I should use that in product? And over the years, like I had kind of refined this system that I'd used. And so like I have turned that into this very repeatable, in many ways, somewhat math-based system that like makes sense to me and is very easy to translate into code and working with engineers. And so like I do that in a couple different places. I do it in typography as well, and just like creating these like sequential systems for establishing a type system, for instance. So that's like one area where like I definitely focus on systems within the world of product design. And then the other area is I am a humongous nerd when it comes to components and what you can do with components. I like, my idea of an exciting Saturday night is just like tinkering with different ways to interconnect components in Figma to like make sure I just don't have to do things more than once. And so a lot of the course is also that. And we just like walk through step by step, like how would you build this area of a product? And I take a component heavy approach, but more so than even just like focusing on the components themselves. The thing that I kind of preach a lot is, as an industry, we generally look at components as this thing that we do after we have our designs figured out. It's like, I've explored, I've got messy, now let's make them rigid and solidified. And I think that's crazy because I think components are like the most effective way to just explore aimlessly, because you can make it so that you just, by minimizing your sources of truth, you can work a lot more quickly and iterate through a wide set of concepts in like half the time kind of thing. I know I'm getting down into rabbit holes now, but like that is another
No, that's great. That's
bucket where I'm quite opinionated. Yeah.
Yeah. And just to your point on components and Figma in general, I feel like, at least for my company, I feel like if someone came to me and they're like, I know Figma like the back of my hand, I can make any component or variant to your specification and like best practices, but I'm not like super good at just like design in general, or I'm kind of like earlier in that or don't have a full grasp on that. Like there is totally a space for that person on a team where someone can like componentize something or organize things or just like totally own the Figma side of it. And I don't want to like tell people like, go just learn this one tool and you'll be set, because inevitably there's going to be another tool after Figma that comes. But I think it's not a bad place right now if you wanted to invest a lot of time into mastering and by proxy learn design that way.
Yeah, I agree. I have this kind of a spectrum in my head a little bit of like two very different approaches to learning design, or maybe like refining your very early skill set would be one, going the more like you think about like the Google UX class, for instance, and it's just like very theory UX focus. And then another way of doing it would be actually just get into Figma, get super comfortable, and just copy all of your favorite products and apps by pixel by pixel. Just copy them and then just ask why, and try to make educated guesses. Maybe this is another area where like I'm actually realizing in this conversation I'm quite an opinionated person, but I would so much rather have someone on my team that is like just copying the heck out of other products and is feeling really fluent in the tool and building up this arsenal of interactions that they feel confident work just because all the really good products are doing it. Because the thing is, like, so much of the UX theory is baked into those interactions anyway. Like we've been refining the core interactions that make up like web and mobile design for so long. And like, yeah, every once in a while you have a really new thing come in, like a Command K, like global search menu, for instance, you know, like that was new, but now it's everywhere. And so like as a young designer, I can look at something like that and be like, you know what, there's probably a pretty good reason why that works. And I can take some guesses as to why. And now I'm just going to design the thing like 3 times. And I think that if you have those visual fundamentals and like a little bit of an understanding as to like why the most popular products are the way that they are, you can soak up so much of like larger design process and UX best practices and ways of thinking within the organization that you're in. I would never expect someone to be able to like hit the ground running on those fronts, because it's like not that hard. In my opinion, it's not that hard to help people level up in a good team, just in terms of just like overarching design process. What is a little bit harder, in my opinion, is to take someone that fundamentally doesn't understand how like the basics of type and layout and color contrast work. And if you have to explain all of those, that is more intimidating in terms of like what it would be like for me to work with a junior designer. That's more intimidating than someone that can't recite a single UX law.
Right. I could not agree with you more, because I think if you take someone and you take them through like a semester's worth of typography and visual hierarchy, that is awesome foundational knowledge to have. But if you then tell that same person, okay, like build me an app interface with these requirements, versus you just tell someone else, hey, for a month, go copy Coinbase, Twitter, whatever, like just go copy these apps, copy them. You're going to learn visual hierarchy and typography without knowing it. You're going to start building in that muscle memory of how to draw attention to elements and how
Mhm.
to bake in, interaction, like priming the user, all of these different things that you're saying. And it's like you kind of learn those while you're learning the skill of the tool without even knowing that, like, this is, color contrast, or this is visual hierarchy, or this is, whatever principle it ties back to. And that's kind of honestly how I fell into it. I started more on like the front end development side, and then like slowly moved into UX. And most of my learning was honestly just from understanding what is good design and then copying that.
Yeah. As long as we're not blindly copying and you're actively making an effort to identify common patterns and similarities across those apps. Like if you're looking at Twitter and looking at Coinbase and you're just looking at their header component, how are they doing that? How is the like inactive versus the active state of these different page navs? Like what are the common patterns that I'm seeing? Like, oh yeah, like the active page is almost always higher contrast. You might not be able to like cite any specific principle, but you're going to start to kind of pick up on it over time.
Right. Yeah. And I think that kind of goes back to, what we were talking earlier about it being more like cooking, like it's a recipe book. And, it's like at this point, I need to add in 2 tablespoons of sugar, or, whatever cooking or baking thing you might do. It's like, okay, when I'm starting out to build an app, I know I'm going to need a header with enough room for like the notch at the top of the phone. And I'm going to need an area for a back button and maybe an info button on the right. And you just like, you refine, you like move the guardrails down smaller. So, like, okay, I have a handful of options here, but it's not like completely wide open to my imagination. It's like, there's a few good patterns. Let's consider what they are and go with the one that makes the most sense for this project.
I totally agree. And then over time, as you gain more and more experience, you start to be able to identify the right moments for when you should capitalize on existing pattern familiarity versus innovate. And it's obviously more fun to innovate, but like you can't just start innovating. You have to understand like what is tried and trusted and where it might benefit from years of other people.
Absolutely. So I have to ask, and this is something I kind of started out like years ago on the track of trying to do, but failed. And I'm guessing lots of people failed. But like, how long did it take you to make your course? And did you ever feel like giving up during your building of it?
Man, it's hard to draw the lines. I mean, it's a long time. I didn't officially launch this thing until January of 2022. And I bought the domain in, I think like May or June of 2020. So it had been marinating for a while. And there was so many, I have so many, probably at this point, very scary looking Notion pages of different ideas and curriculum concepts. And I have this tendency to like think way too big out the gate. And so I'm always like working backwards. And so some of the ideas are just like audacious, And as a result, a thing that works really well for me is I got to just draw a line in the sand at some point and set a hard deadline, because I had this landing page up for almost a year, collecting emails, had done nothing behind the scenes. And so what I did is I put out a tweet and I scheduled an email to everyone on the mailing list. And I said, hey, the beta's launching in August. And I had done zero work. And this was in May, I think. And so I was just like, I will write down ideas forever. Like I have to have some forcing function to make me do this thing. And I did it. And like the 3 days before releasing it, I was just like cramming in like video editing and all this stuff and updating the curriculum and whatnot. And at that point, and I guess for more context, I basically just gave people like a pretty steep discount and said, hey, you'll get access to all of the future lessons. And for getting in early, you'll get this sweet deal. And that was almost a year and a half after I bought the domain.
Yeah.
So it took a really long time. And honestly, I didn't super tangibly move the needle until 2 months before that beta.
That's amazing. I think your point of like making yourself have a like accountability date where kind of forces you to do it is fantastic. I've been thinking about all of the times in the past where, it's like I bought a domain name, I've had an idea, I've put in a few weeks of work, and then I get like discouraged or bored and it just like dies and goes away. And like,
yeah, that's most of my domain names.
It's just paying our rights as designers to do that. But in the one product that I did launch was Boot Sketch, which was basically just a 1-for-1 copy of Bootstrap within Sketch.
Cool.
And I kind of did like a similar thing where I was like, I think I scheduled it on Product Hunt to be like launched at like a certain date. And I was like, has to get done by then. And going through it, I'm like, well, I wouldn't buy this. Is this stupid? Is this a waste of time? And I'm like, I've had way too many ideas that I've just not done. And I need to just do it just for the sake of doing it. Just so I can know, just so I can say I've like launched something and not got something 50%, 60% and like never done it the full way. And that was awesome. That was like one of the like highlights of my like design career thus far, because it like paid my mortgage for like 4 years.
Yeah, it's amazing.
It's like doing stuff always leads to good things in my opinion. Like,
I agree.
Whether it's mentoring someone, whether it's building your own product, whether it's writing a blog post, I feel like anything that you do in the design field, to even if you're wrong, even if you write a blog post that's like completely wrong, it's like, okay, well, you got a lot of eyeballs on it, you got a lot of notoriety or whatever. I feel like anything that you do in that way for your career really long term helps you.
Yeah, in so many ways too, because it's like it demonstrates your own interest in the craft and interest in growing yourself and exploring and tinkering. And like, you're right. Like, even if you wrote this blog post, it's just straight up wrong a year from now, who cares? I would look at that and be like, that person's putting themselves out there. That person is pushing themselves to grow. Like, that's a really attractive quality when you're looking with who do you want to surround yourself? Like, who do you want to collaborate with? So I couldn't agree more. I also think that everyone should try to make $1 on the internet. Like, the difference between $0 and $1 on the internet is massive. It's so exciting. It's like a giant rush. Everyone should try and do it.
Yeah, I will tell you this. Being in consulting and whatever, doing project work and figuring out your bill rate, sometimes maybe you come out a little ahead if you do like a fixed bid. Maybe, maybe someone out there, if you've made something like $250 an hour on a project, I will tell you, $250 an hour does not compare to the feeling of selling something for $15. Well,
yeah,
it is.
Couldn't agree more.
It hits different, and I don't know why, but it is amazing.
It doesn't grow old either. Like, I woke up this morning and I like rolled over and I was like, all right, what was it? Like, what are the sales today? And you see like some team license come in and you're just like, I cannot believe that happened while I was dead asleep. Like, it just doesn't grow old.
It's amazing. There's so many cool opportunities for little things, like little businesses. You don't have to go raise funding. You don't have to be $1 million company. There's so many like opportunities, whether it's like icon packs or illustration packs or design files or mini courses that people could like significantly change their life with, that maybe it makes, a few $100s a week,
Yeah. And it's so easy to spin up now with Gumroad and Lemon Squeezy and all of these platforms. And not only that, but every time you put your ideas out there, you are going to refine your ideas, or someone else will refine them for you, because the difference between taking something that's in your head and putting it out there, especially in an educational context. I mean, I fundamentally changed how I approached certain types of problems in Figma as a result of just thinking through from first principles. How do I explain this thing? How do I take what's in my head and make it coherent for another person? Every single time you do that, you deepen the understanding of that thing, regardless of whether it's how to create a cohesive icon set or how to build components in Figma, how to write well, how to make effective Loom videos to pitch your ideas. Like, it doesn't matter. The principle will always apply. So you asked the question, you know, even just like looking back on your career, what are the different things that are like highs or lows or learning points or things that you would like give yourself advice, like going backwards? I would want myself to put myself out there so much more, like from the beginning. Just don't waste time. Start, even if you're learning, like so many people think that, well, you have to be an expert to share. And that's just like not the case, because people like learning from people that have been doing this a long time and refining the craft, but they also like learning from people on the same career rung in the ladder as them, and being inspired from people that are like on the journey or maybe 1 or 2 steps ahead of them. There's always someone that's going to look at you and be like, man, I just want to get to where they're at.
Absolutely. Thinking about Figma Academy and then where you are now at Maven, you were kind of saying how the one kind of ties into the other. Maybe you could explain a little bit of what Maven is and how Figma Academy ties into that.
Yeah, so it's all kind of one big connected story, because what Maven is a platform for cohort-based courses. So instead of a bunch of video lessons that you go through on your own time, you're going through a course over a fixed amount of time. Maybe it's 2 or 3 weeks. You're going through it with a group of people. It's like 30 people. There's a lot of interaction with those people. It's project-based. So it's a really exciting way to learn. And I feel like we're still in the first inning in terms of what that's going to look like for online education. So if we go back in the story to when I was helping out Matt with Shift Nudge, I was kind of thinking about like, okay, what would this look like for Shift Nudge? And now we have the acronym like CBC, or cohort-based course. That didn't exist at the time, but I was kind of pitching him on that same model. And he kind of said, okay, like, well, go figure it out. What does that look like? And so I just started Googling, how would I set this up? And obviously I'm processing Figma Academy behind the scenes. So I'm thinking about like, maybe that's what it looks like for my course as well. And this would have been January of 2021. And I kind of had this aha moment of, whoa, this is so much bigger than design education. Like there's a fundamental lack of infrastructure needed to push this whole next era of online learning forward. And at that point, I pretty much realized I want to quit my job and find people that are working on this. I don't want to start up from scratch myself, because I was still just kind of exhausted and burned out from the first go around at that. But I did want to get in early and really shape this thing. And so I spent like a couple months looking for the team that was working on it, and randomly was listening to one of my favorite podcasters, and he was interviewing my now boss, Gagan Biani, who is the co-founder of Udemy. And he was telling this other podcaster, David, basically his vision for Maven, but it wasn't even called Maven yet. And I'm listening to this podcast, I'm on a plane, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is it. And so I landed, I got on my computer, and I emailed the heck out of them until they gave me a job, basically.
So this is probably another good lesson we could learn. Like when you find a job that you really want, or you feel like you're best suited for, like how did you go about applying for that and kind of getting in front of them and actually landing the job?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, I definitely put a lot of thought into that first email and tried to just make it so obvious that this is a specific area that I cared about, and it wasn't just like another job to me. But then like I guess like a higher level takeaway that other people could maybe run with is I also did not wait for structured interaction points to like share thoughts and ideas. And so like even between interviews, like I think we had like an initial portfolio review maybe, or maybe there was a phone call. I can't exactly remember, but like before even the next call, I would send him an email and just be like, hey, by the way, this is something I'm thinking about in this space. Boom, 2 paragraphs, just a way to demonstrate like, again, this is something I care about. Like I have thoughts, I have opinions here. And I did that a couple times. And then the funnier part is at the very end, after the final portfolio presentation or interview, I don't remember what it was, but after I no longer had a next touch point on the calendar, I signed off my email to my now friend and coworker Shreyans. And I said, here are the 3 reasons why I refuse to believe that there is anyone on this planet more qualified for this role than me. 1, 2, 3, enter, send. And it worked. It worked. I think, I don't know. I tried to think about like, what would my reaction be to getting this kind of an email? And I was like, I think I'd probably think that this person's like a go-getter. So I was like, yeah, screw it.
Yeah.
Hit send. It worked.
That's awesome. I will say there's a handful of people on the UX cabin team. They're here because they followed up in like a respective, proactive manner that other people didn't. And like, they really wanted something. And I think there's a fine line between being like annoying and like proactive. So it's not just like spamming the person or the job board until you get it. But there's something about just like having a bug in their ear of like, hey, maybe it's not the right time right now, but let's chat in, another month or in Q2 or whatever. And just having that like proactive, hey, I'm still here and I think I'm really well positioned for this position or for this job. And just like you said, thinking about from their perspective, what is the most enticing or what's the selling points from their perspective. I don't know if you've ever watched Survivor, but one of the OGs on Survivor, Rob, I think he's won it maybe a few times, or at least won it and got to the finals a bunch of times. But he basically said like at night, what he did in Survivor is he would sit and think, what is the best angle? What is the best strategy for every single other person on the island? And how do I need to position my pitch to them to work with me from their perspective for them, what makes the most sense for them? I think that's brilliant strategy.
Yeah.
Because if we're thinking about employers or jobs or contracts or whatever, like think about it from their perspective. What risk do you need to mitigate? What thing do you need to reassure them about? What do you need to highlight about yourself that goes into the back of their mind and is like makes them feel comfortable with you?
I love those questions. It's definitely, in my opinion, it's a quality over quantity thing. Like I would so much rather spend the time to write 3 well-crafted and like we say personalized, but it's not just about like the individual that you're reaching out to, but like make them know that this is not just like a copy and paste outreach message. Like you care about this company, like something about this company. You've done the research. There's a reason why you're reaching out. 3 of those trumps 15 generic outreaches every time, in my opinion.
Absolutely. I completely agree. You can stand out a huge way from doing that because most people are going to copy and paste or just blind apply or whatever. And I think you can even go another step further and make yourself like a Loom intro.
Yeah, I was just about to say that. I love that idea.
No one is doing this. If you do this, you will probably at least get a call back. There's these little things that you could take 5 minutes extra to do, or even do a really short mini portfolio review that no one else is doing. And you can get yourself to the head of the pack by a really nice letter and maybe a Loom video.
Yep. I couldn't agree more. One time I took a Webflow template and created a new page on my website, and it was / and then the company I was applying for. And I just kind of wrote my cover letter as a website. It only took like, I don't know, it took like an hour or something like that, but it was so worth it. Like I got a response from somebody that everyone would know on this podcast as a result of that email.
That is brilliant. I love that idea. Oh, man. Well, this has been a great chat, Rid. I really appreciate you taking the time to come on and share your philosophy and your ideas and your journey. Anything else before we sign off for the day?
I guess my closing thoughts would be, don't underestimate the power of just appreciating other people's work, because it's not that big of an industry. And if you use a product that you like, if you see some landing page that you think really catches your eye, it takes like 20 seconds to find that person on Twitter and just send them a DM, not asking for anything at all, and just say like, yo, I love this work. Like I just wanted to say I love this work. And that's kind of like, I've made that habit over the last year, and the ROI on those little messages is ridiculous, and it's not that scary. So I highly encourage everyone to try it.
Completely agree. I just got a message on Twitter about the podcast, and it was just, nothing crazy. It was just like, hey, thanks for making this. This is really cool, and I enjoy listening to it. And it's like, I don't know, it just makes you feel good.
Yeah, major morning, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And now I'm connected with that person. I'm following that person. I'm kind of invested in their like little short online life and success and everything
and
like
if
that.
In the future, they maybe you forget about them, and 6 months from now, a year from now, they have a specific question for you, or maybe they're like looking for a job at your company. Then they send that next message, and you have no idea who they are, but you look up and there's that like shout of appreciation above it, and that is powerful.
Exactly, 100%, absolutely. Well, man, just dropping knowledge bombs on us here as we wrap up. But Britt, again, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate the time, and best of luck on all of your educational endeavors.
Yeah, I appreciate it. This was a blast. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks so much for hanging out with us today on the Product Design Podcast. If you enjoyed our conversation, be sure and go follow our guests. Let them know they did a great job and you learned a lot. More to come in the following weeks as we bring on new guests. Please hit that subscribe button so that you will get these podcasts and learn a ton about the product design community. Excited to see you next time. Thanks.